You know, there's a certain kind of cold that only exists in a rich family's dining room when you're asking for something they don't think you deserve. My name is Sharon Lewis. I had a meticulous plan to build a community farm, a real breathing legacy from the ground up. I just needed a loan. Instead, my father laughed, called my dream playing in the dirt, and then in the same breath co-signed for my sister's multi-million-dollar Georgetown home. They didn't just say no. They made it clear I was the daughter they were willing to let fail, but they made one mistake they never imagined I'd fight back. This is the story of how I lost a family and built a home. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The strange thing isn't that my father destroyed my life. It's that he did it with a smile right after passing the salt. I sat at the gleaming mahogany table, the air in our Boston dining room, so sterile it felt hard to breathe. I was 28, fresh off a 2-year apprenticeship on a sustainable farm in Oregon, and I was an alien at my own family's table. Across from me sat Mark Lewis, my father, a man who didn't just develop land but conquered it. Beside him, my mother, Catherine, a woman who weaponized charity events like a battlefield general. And next to me, my younger sister, Eliza, all polished ambition and political aid credentials, her phone buzzing silently on the lace tablecloth. I'd spent 6 months preparing for this. I cleared my throat, the sound obnoxiously loud over the quiet clinking of silver. As I emailed you all, I began sliding 3 professionally bound presentations across the table. I'm here to present the Harvest Hub. I launched into my pitch, my voice gaining strength as I spoke. I laid out the meticulous plan, the purchase of the defunct 50-acre Granger's Mill in Miller's Creek, a struggling Appalachian fringe town. I detailed the conversion into a sustainable farming co-op, a community kitchen, a year-round farmers market. I had soil reports, letters of support from the town 5-year projections. I'm not asking for a handout, I said firmly, meeting my father's gaze. I'm requesting a professional bridge loan against my portion of the family trust. I have a full repayment schedule with interest. It's to secure the property before we bring in outside investors. My father, Mark, actually laughed. It was a short, dry bark that cut me off mid-sentence. Playing in the dirt, Sharon Granger's mill, that valley is a graveyard. He tapped his temple. The trust is illiquid right now, tied up in real ventures. It's financially irresponsible to waste a Lewis legacy on a dying town full of, well, you know. My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with disappointment. Sharon, darling, why can't you be more realistic like your sister? As if on cue, Eliza placed her phone face down and beamed. Actually, I have some news too. All eyes snapped to her. Devin proposed last night. His father, the junior senator, is thrilled. The room erupted. My father was on his feet, uncorking a bottle of champagne I hadn't even seen. Now that, he boomed, is a smart merger. My mother was weeping with joy. My binders, my soil reports, my entire future were literally shoved aside on the table to make room for the flutes. My father raised his glass, the champagne fizzing. To Eliza, he declared, his eyes finding mine for just a second. For building a real legacy. I looked at my plan, the one meant to feed 100 families, and I knew with a cold, sinking certainty that no wasn't just a refusal, it was a judgment. I didn't go back to Oregon. I went to my bank. Fueled by a cold, hard spite and a stubborn, desperate belief in my plan, I drained every cent from my personal savings. It was $14, $210 to be exact. I drove my old Subaru 4 hours west to Miller's Creek and rented a tiny cold water flat above the town's failing general store. The floor slanted toward the street, and the ancient radiator hissed like a cornered snake, but it was a start. I was embodying the American dream of resilience, whether I liked it or not. The town, however, was not happy to see me. Lewis, the woman at the diner asked, her eyes narrowing when I paid for my coffee. You related to Mark Lewis. My father's reputation for predatory development had preceded me. He'd spent a decade trying to buy up the valley. They saw me as a spy, the opening salvo in another one of his land grabs. For a week, I was adrift in a sea of skepticism until the man downstairs finally gave me a second look. Dave Grant, the gruff third-generation owner of the very general store I was living above, cornered me by the dusty shelves of canned goods. "You're either stupid or you're serious," he said, his arms crossed. "Which is it?" His store was being bled dry by the big box suppliers from the next county over, and he was just desperate enough to listen. I showed him the binders. He was the only one. We knew my father's loan was a dead end. "We pivot." I told him the idea forming even as I spoke it. "We don't go to the banks, we go to the town." The next night we were in the musty town hall, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. We proposed a massive all-or-nothing gamble, a community-supported agriculture drive. We needed 100 families to prepay $500 each for a year's worth of produce. Produce that didn't exist yet from a farm we didn't own. The $50,000 wasn't enough to buy Granger's Mill, not even close. It was just enough to secure a 1-year high-interest lease on the property with a massive, terrifying balloon payment due in exactly 12 months. It was a bet on ourselves, on the land. It took a grueling 2 weeks of knocking on doors, begging in church basements, and staking my entire reputation on a promise. Finally, the 100th family signed up. Dave and I met the holding company's lawyer and signed the lease. The ink was still wet as we walked out onto the street, the keys to the mill heavy in my hand. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Heard you're still playing with those poor people. Don't come crying to us when you get your pretty dress muddy." I looked down at my hands already raw from pulling weeds on the walk up to the mill. "Too late," I muttered. Granger's Mill wasn't just dormant, it was a corpse. The air in the main barn was thick with the stench of mold and ammonia from long-gone animals, and the fields were a graveyard of rusted-out equipment and thorn bushes thick as a man's arm. The first day, Dave Arthur, a 70-year-old retired farmhand with hands like petrified wood, and I just stood there overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the decay. We weren't just farming, we were performing an exorcism. The work began at 4 a.m. and didn't end until we collapsed well after midnight, our muscles screaming. 18-hour days became the norm, fueled by stale coffee from Dave's store and a kind of shared, stubborn desperation. The first battle was with the soil itself. The back 40 acres hadn't just been left fallow. They'd been used as a dumping ground for half a century. We spent a solid week just pulling trash. And the wire. My God, the wire. It wasn't just a fence line. It was a tangled, rusted nest woven deep into the earth. We'd hook Dave's pickup to a single strand, and the truck would groan tires spinning in the mud before a 20-foot section, thick with roots and rocks, would rip free from the ground like the devil's dental work. By the end of the first week, my hands, even through thick leather gloves, were a raw pulp of blisters and deep stinging cuts. Our first victory was the tractor. Arthur found it half sunk in a collapsed shed, a 1970s Massey Ferguson, a 4,000-pound brick of rust. We spent 3 days siphoning out sludgy, waterlogged fuel, rebuilding the carburetor with parts we bought on eBay, and hot wiring the ignition. When it finally coughed to life in a cloud of blue-black smoke, we cheered like we'd won the lottery. That victory lasted exactly 4 hours. I was in the north field turning over the heavy clay-like soil for the first time in decades when I smelled it, not the sweet smell of diesel, but the acrid, stinging stench of electrical smoke. I looked down and saw orange flames licking up from the engine block. I didn't even think. I just bailed, hitting the hard-packed earth and rolling as the old wiring harness went up like a Roman candle. We put it out with the 2 fire extinguishers from the barn and shovelfuls of dirt, but the damage was done. The engine was a scorched, smoking wreck. I sat there in the mud covered in white chemical foam and just stared at it. That was the first time I almost cried. "Well," Arthur said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice, "reckon she needs a new distributor." We couldn't afford a new tractor, so we learned to fix the old one. Dave and I drove to 3 different scrapyards in 2 counties pulling parts from skeletal tractor chassis. Arthur, a patient and rough teacher, taught me how to arc weld. I learned to brace myself against the blinding blue light that stung my eyes, even through the mask, the sharp smell of ozone and hot metal filling my lungs. I learned to lay a steady bead, my hands shaking at first, then out of sheer necessity becoming firm. My business plan girl, hands the ones that had typed out projections and held champagne flutes, were becoming calloused, scarred, and permanently stained with grease. I stopped wearing nail polish. It just chipped off in an hour. I learned to unjam the antique chain-driven harvester we'd bought at auction by kicking it in a very specific spot on the flywheel, a trick that made Arthur cackle. I was no longer a Lewis visiting town. When I walked into the diner, my hair tied back in a greasy bandana, I was just Sharon, and they'd have a black coffee and a plate of eggs waiting for me. I had earned my name. The biggest test came in November. A freezing rainstorm sharp as glass swept in from the mountains. The main barn roof, the one where we were storing our precious hard-won seed stock for the spring, sprung a dozen leaks. It wasn't a drip. It was a deluge. "We've got to patch it now or we lose the seed," Dave yelled over the roar of the wind. The roof was a 40-foot climb and it was now coated in a slick, treacherous half-inch of ice. "I'm lightest," I said, my voice barely audible. I grabbed a safety harness, a bucket of tar, and a hammer. Arthur, his face pale and grim, anchored the rope to the smoking tractor. For 3 hours in the dark in a freezing gale, I was on that roof. I slid on the slick, 100-year-old shingles, the wind trying to peel me off like a sticker. Every time I nailed down a patch of tar paper, the hammer would slip on the frozen metal, the impact jarring my bones until my teeth ached. I was terrified. But as I looked down at the weak yellow light from the barn, at Dave and Arthur rushing below to cover the seed bags with tarps, I felt something new. It wasn't just anger at my father. It was a fierce, protective ownership. This was my farm. These were my people. We survived the winter. Spring came, and with it, the first green shoots of spinach and kale. The town, seeing the impossible happen, was buzzing. Our CSA was a wild success. We had a waiting list. But as our farm came to life, something else was circling. Dave, who handled our meager books and town hall relations, started noticing it first. "Summit Ridge Properties," he said one night in April, spreading county plat maps across the kitchen table in my small apartment. "It's a new LLC, registered in Delaware." He pointed to the map with a grease-stained finger. "In the last 2 months, they've bought up 3 small, seemingly useless parcels. All of them, around us." He showed me the plots, a dry creek bed, an unbuildable rocky slope just north of our property line, and a forgotten, overgrown logging access road to the west. "I tried to find out who's behind it," he said, frowning. "It's a corporate dead end, all shell companies. It feels wrong, Sharon. It feels like a vulture circling something it thinks is about to die." A cold prickle of dread went down my spine, but I was too busy with the spring planting, too focused on the immediate tangible threats of weather and pests, to give it the fear it deserved. The full-blown betrayal arrived in late May, not as a threat, but in a gleaming black Mercedes that looked ridiculous parked next to our rusted-out flatbed. My mother, Catherine Lewis, had arrived for what her assistant had emailed Dave about a community outreach visit. She was donating 2 ornamental cast-iron benches to the Millers Creek Town Square, a PR move I'm sure my father's firm would write off as a generous charitable donation. She insisted on a tour of the farm. She walked through the damp spring mud in $800 heels, wrinkling her nose at the rich, healthy smell of compost and manure that now to me just smelled like life. "Well," she said, pulling me aside near the clucking chicken coop, her voice a strained, bright brittle, "this is just a cute hobby, dear. You've certainly made a statement." I just wiped the sweat from my forehead with my forearm, leaving a streak of dirt. "But I really came to tell you our good news," she continued, not waiting for a response. "Your father and I finally closed on Eliza's new Georgetown home, a beautiful place right on the canal. We co-signed, of course. It's just so much easier to invest in something secure, something with real tangible value. And there it was. The red ribbon, the casual drive-by announcement that while I was fighting for scraps, sleeping on a lumpy mattress and learning to weld a dead tractor back to life just to survive, they were handing Eliza a multi-million-dollar life without her even having to ask. The old Sharon would have crumpled. The old Sharon would have cried or screamed or pointed out the screaming bitter hypocrisy. But the woman standing in front of her covered in chicken feed and engine grease just seethed. The anger was so cold, so pure, it was almost calming. I didn't say anything. I just bent down, ignoring the protest of my aching back, and scooped up a double handful of the dark, rich, beautiful compost Arthur and I had spent 6 months nurturing. It was alive with earthworms and smelled of rain and decay and promise. I held it out to her just inches from her immaculate white silk blouse. "This is real, Mom," I said, my voice quiet but harder than any stone on this farm. "It's not a photo op, it's not a hobby, and it's going to feed this town." Catherine's practiced smile faltered. She looked at my dirt-caked hands, at the calluses, at the cold fury in my eyes, and for the first time in my life, she looked unsettled. She actually took a step back, a flicker of fear in her eyes. "Well, I see you're busy." She turned and walked back to her car, her heels sinking deep into the mud with every step. She left without another word, her Mercedes kicking up a cloud of dust as it sped away. I watched her go, the rich compost still clutched in my fist. I felt like I had won, but the victory tasted like ash. I went back to the barn, the adrenaline fading, leaving me exhausted and hollow. I was pitching hay into the stalls, the rhythmic work a comfort, when Dave ran in, his face pale in the dim light. He wasn't holding a plat map this time. He was holding a stack of stapled incorporation papers, the kind you get from a private investigator, the kind that cost money we didn't have. "Sharon," he said, his voice quiet, shaking. "I found out who's behind Summit Ridge Properties. I had to pay a guy in Wilmington, a friend of a friend, but I found them." He held out the paper. "It's not a company, Sharon. It's a trust. The Lewis Family Strategic Trust. And the sole trustee, it's your father." The revelation that Summit Ridge Properties was my father didn't just feel like a betrayal, it felt like a declaration of war. Dave and I stood under the single flickering bulb in my tiny apartment kitchen, the private investigator's report spread out on the formica table. It wasn't just a land grab, it was personal. He hadn't just refused me, he was now actively, systematically, and ruthlessly trying to destroy me. The balloon payment on our lease was looming just 8 weeks away. We were counting on the entire summer harvest, the tomatoes, the corn, the sweet peppers, the lucrative berry crop to make that payment and secure our first real bank loan. And that's exactly when my father, Mark Lewis, began his siege. He wasn't just trying to buy Granger's mill, he was trying to break it. He was trying to break me before the payment was due. The first attack was silent and utterly devastating. It came in late June, just as a blistering heat wave settled over the valley, the air shimmering and thick. The creek that fed our hand-dug irrigation lines, the lifeblood of the entire mill, began to slow. It went from a healthy musical gurgle to a weak trickle, and then, over the course of 48 agonizing hours, to a muddy, cracked bed of dry, sun-baked stones. "It's the heat wave," Arthur said, his voice tight with worry as he kicked the dry bank. "It's just the heat." But Dave shook his head, his face a grim, pale mask. He'd walked the 5 miles upstream. "He bought the water rights," Dave said, his voice flat dead. "Summit Ridge Properties closed on the old quarry property 5 miles north last week. The one that controls the springhead. My father had dammed the spring. With one signature on a deed, he had turned off our water. We watched, utterly helpless, as the fields began to die. It was a slow, agonizing execution. The broad leaves of the zucchini plants, which had been so vibrant, wilted and blackened at the edges as if they'd been burned. The tomatoes, just beginning to blush red, stopped growing, their skins shriveling on the vine. The young corn stalks, which had been so tall and green, drooped their tassels, drying to a brittle brown. The air, which should have smelled of sweet clover and damp earth, now smelled like dust and decay. We were running a bucket brigade from the old, slow-producing well just to keep the fragile seedlings in the greenhouse alive, but the fields were a write-off. We were losing thousands of dollars a day watching our entire inventory wither to brown paper under a cloudless sky. The second attack was loud. It came a week later, the rumble of heavy machinery waking me before dawn. I ran out, my heart pounding in my chest, Dave and Arthur close behind. We stopped dead at the end of the driveway. At the entrance to our only access road, the one-lane dirt track that connected Granger's Mill to the county highway, two massive 20-foot concrete barriers were being lowered into place by a crane. Men in reflective vests and hard hats were drilling posts for a 10-foot chain-link fence sealing the gap. A huge professionally printed sign was nailed to a new post, the vinyl gleaming in the early light. Private property, Summit Ridge LLC. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted under penalty of law. My father had bought the small, forgotten half-acre parcel of land that contained the mouth of our road. It was a piece of land nobody had thought about in 50 years, a landlocked scrap that was worthless to anyone except us. But he'd found it, and he'd bought it. We were an island. Our CSA members, the lifeblood of our weekly income, couldn't get in to pick up their shares. We couldn't get our meager, drought-stricken produce out to the farmer's market in the next town. We were legally completely cut off from the world. We were prisoners on our own farm. The third attack came that same afternoon, as if timed for maximum psychological impact. A gleaming black county car, the official seal on its door, pulled up, parking neatly beside the new barriers. A man in a crisp polo shirt and pressed slacks got out, holding a clipboard. My stomach dropped. I recognized him instantly. Ron Stevens. He was a regular at my father's boozy Christmas parties, a man who always laughed a little too loud at Mark's jokes and bragged about his golf handicap. "Sharon," he said, adjusting his sunglasses and feigning surprise. "Well, didn't realize this was your project." He called himself the county inspector dispatched on an anonymous tip about unsafe conditions. He spent an hour walking the property, his lip curled in distaste at the chickens. He found a dozen critical violations. The wiring in the 100-year-old barn, the same wiring that had been there for a century, was suddenly an imminent fire hazard and not up to commercial code. The grading of our fields, which we'd tilled ourselves with Arthur's ancient tractor, was cited as a critical erosion risk to the now dry creek bed. Our chicken coop, the one we'd built by hand from reclaimed lumber, was an unpermitted permanent structure, built without a zoning variance. He shook his head, a perfect practiced performance of mock regret. "I'm sorry, Sharon, but my hands are tied. I've got no choice but to red tag the main barn, effective immediately." He slapped a huge, ugly red sticker on the barn door. "And I'm afraid I have to issue a notice to condemn the entire property unless these violations are rectified in, well, you can't even get a concrete truck or an electrician in here, can you?" He smiled just a little. "You're shut down." That was it. That was the snap. I didn't say anything to Dave. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just walked to my Subaru, got in, and drove. I drove the 4 hours back to Boston, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my heart a cold, tight knot of pure, undiluted rage. I was still in my mud-caked boots and torn, sweat-stained jeans. I didn't care. I stalked past the polished receptionist in my father's high-rise office, ignoring her, "Ma'am, you can't go in there," and kicked open the heavy oak door to his corner suite. He was there on a conference call, looking serene, a skyline of glass and steel behind him. He saw me, and his eyes didn't even flicker. He just calmly finished his sentence. I walked to his massive $10,000 glass desk. From my jacket pocket, I pulled a single withered, yellowed ear of corn, one of the thousands dying in my field. I slammed it down on his desk right on top of his immaculate leather-bound blotter. It made a pathetic dry rattle. Why? My voice was a low, shaking hiss that I barely recognized. It's just a farm. Why are you doing this to me? My father, Mark Lewis, ended his call with a calm, "Jeffrey, I'll call you back." He swiveled in his chair to face me, his expression not one of anger, but of a kind of weary disappointment, as if I were a slow-witted child who had just tracked mud on his carpet. "It's not just a farm, Sharon," he said, steepling his fingers. "It's an asset. Or rather, it's a liability sitting on my real asset." He gestured out the panoramic window. "I'm buying the entire valley. It's the perfect location for the new Summit Ridge Resort. Luxury golf course, a gated community 5-star spa. And your little mud pit, your little commune for unwashed farmers is the centerpiece. It's dragging down the property values for the entire project. It's an eyesore. I gave you a chance to walk away, Sharon. I told you no. You should have listened." "He's right, you know." The voice came from the plush leather couch in the corner, a corner I hadn't even looked at in my fury. Eliza. She was sitting there sipping a latte from a branded paper cup, looking as polished and serene as my father, as if she were waiting for a meeting. She stood up, smoothing her silk blouse, not a flicker of shame on her face. "Sharon, just stop. You're embarrassing us. You look like a vagrant. You smell like a barn." She walked over, placing a placating hand on my father's shoulder. "Dad is offering to buy you out for what you put in. It's a generous offer. Just take it. It's just business." She said it with such casual, bored dismissal. And that's when I saw it. She wasn't just a bystander. She wasn't just the golden child blissfully ignorant. Her fiancé was a politician. Her future was tied to this. She was the polished, public-facing advocate for this project, the one who would smile at town halls and talk about sustainable luxury and job creation while my father choked the life and water out of Miller's Creek. She wasn't just complicit, she was a co-conspirator. My father slid a check across the desk. It was for $14,000, exactly what I'd started with. "Take the check, Sharon," he said, his voice as cold as the glass on his desk. "Go back to Oregon. Go play in someone else's dirt. Consider this an expensive lesson." I looked at the check. I looked at my sister, her face a perfect mask of polite concern, the perfect lobbyist's daughter. I looked at my father, his face impassive as if he were foreclosing on a stranger not murdering his own daughter's dream. "He's not buying me out," I whispered, the rage making my voice shake so hard it hurt. "He's trying to erase me. He's trying to pretend none of this ever happened." I turned, my eyes burning with a hatred so pure it terrified me, to Eliza. "And you're holding the eraser." I picked up the check, and then very slowly I tore it in half, and then in quarters. I let the pieces flutter down onto the withered ear of corn. "I'll see you in hell," I said. I turned and walked out, ignoring my father's sharp, sudden intake of breath. I drove the 4 hours back to the farm, a black hollow void where my heart used to be. I don't know what I was expecting, but when I pulled up to the barricade in the twilight, Dave was just standing there, his shoulders slumped, looking utterly defeated. He didn't even look at me. He just pointed to the big red tag on the barn. A new sign had been nailed to the barn door right over Ron Stevens's red tag. It was bright white, official, and utterly final. "Sheriff's seizure by order of the county court, property to be vacated in 48 hours. The 48-hour clock started ticking. It was a perfectly timed execution. The lease payment was due on Monday at noon. The sheriff's seizure was scheduled for Monday at 9 a.m. The injunction was already active. We were broke, we were blocked, and we were being evicted, all while our entire net worth rotted in the sun-scorched fields just 50 feet on the other side of my father's fence. We were trapped. The first 24 hours were a blur of desperate, frantic phone calls. We called lawyers, but none would touch a case against Mark Lewis on a weekend with no money down. We called the bank begging for an extension on the balloon payment, But without access to our harvest, we had no collateral. The answer was a polite, firm no. We were checkmated. The sun set on that first day, and the reality of our failure settled over the farm like a physical shroud. The heat of the day bled away, replaced by a cold, indifferent moon that illuminated the dying fields. All of it. The back-breaking work, the rusted wire, the frozen nights on the roof, the community's trust, all of it was for nothing. I walked into the main barn, the big ugly red tag on the door flapping in the night breeze. I sank down onto a straw bale, the smell of mold and dust filling my lungs. I finally completely broke. I put my head in my hands, my body shaking with dry, racking sobs that tore up from my gut. I had failed. I had failed Arthur, who had poured his retirement into this place. I had failed the 100 families who had prepaid for food I couldn't deliver. And I had failed Dave, who had tied his own failing store to my insane gamble. I had proven my father right. I was a failure. I was just a girl playing in the dirt. I don't know how long I sat there, hollowed out, a ghost in my own graveyard. The barn door creaked open, and Dave stood silhouetted against the moonlight. He just watched me for a long, quiet moment. I couldn't even look at him. "I'm so sorry, Dave," I whispered, my voice a raw croak. "He won. It's over." He walked over his boots, heavy on the packed earth floor. He didn't sit. He just grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in with a force that startled me, and hauled me to my feet. "Get up, Lewis," he said, his voice a low, rough growl I'd never heard before. "Get up!" He shook me once hard. "He didn't win. It's not over. We're not losing a war, Sharon. We're moving a harvest." I just stared at him, uncomprehending. "How? We can't." "He blocked the road, Sharon. He didn't block the sky." He dragged me to the barn door and pointed out into the dead night. "He owns a 30-foot strip of land. He doesn't own the whole county." He turned and stalked over to the old emergency radio we kept by the generator, the one the town used for floods and blizzards. He grabbed the microphone. "He wants a war. We'll give him a war." He flipped the switch and the radio crackled to life with a burst of static. Meanwhile, Arthur, who had been standing in the shadows, pulled out an ancient flip phone. "I might be old," he muttered, "but I've buried more farmers than that city bastard's ever met. It's time to make some calls." Dave's voice boomed out over the emergency channel, a channel every farmer, trucker, and volunteer firefighter monitored. "This is Dave Grant at Granger's Mill," he barked. "Mark Lewis has us barricaded. He's trying to kill the harvest. He's trying to kill the mill. We've got 24 hours. We need hands. We need trucks. We need help." It started as a few pinpricks of light on the distant ridge maybe an hour later. I thought I was imagining it. Then the pinpricks became a dozen, then 50. Within an hour, the county highway outside my father's barricade was a solid, blazing line of headlights. It looked like the biggest traffic jam in the history of the valley. A sea of pickup trucks, flatbeds, ancient tractors, and horse trailers flooded the access point. And then the people. They came with buckets, with wheelbarrows, with plastic crates, with laundry baskets. They came from 3 counties over. The townspeople, the CSA members, the farmers. Arthur had called. They just kept coming, a silent, determined army. They didn't breach my father's fence. They didn't touch his no trespassing signs. They formed a human chain. It was the most beautiful, insane thing I had ever seen. The chain started in our fields. A dozen people picked the tomatoes, tossing them gently to another line, who packed them in crates. The crates were run by wheelbarrow to the edge of our property, right up to my father's new fence. The crates were then lifted up and over the 10-foot barricade and passed hand to hand by 100 people standing on the other side, a living conveyor belt that stretched over the concrete barriers, across the forbidden road, and into the beds of the waiting trucks. In the dead of night, under the cold moon, we were stealing our own harvest right under my father's nose. We worked for hours, a frantic, rhythmic, silent machine. The only sounds were the crickets, the shuffling of feet, and the quiet thump of crates being loaded. Then the inevitable. The sweep of high beams cut through the darkness, and a caravan of vehicles, 2 county sheriff cars and a black Cadillac, screeched to a halt. My father, Mark Lewis, got out of the Cadillac, his face a mask of pure reptilian rage. With him was his lawyer and Ron Stevens, and the sheriff himself. "This is illegal!" My father roared, his voice echoing in the night. "Every single one of you is trespassing, Sheriff. I want them all arrested. I want them arrested now." The sheriff, a good man named Collier who was clearly caught in an impossible position, stepped forward, his hand on his megaphone. "Folks, I can't let you do this. This is private property. You have to disperse." The human chain faltered. The buzz of the crowd died to a nervous, angry murmur. This was it. The final move. My father was using the law to kill us. But as he was striding forward, I was running back. I ran from the field to my apartment to the stack of legal pads and research I hadn't even told Dave about. Because while Dave was rallying the town, I had been at the county archive, pulling on the one thread my father's lawyers had been too arrogant or too lazy to look for. I ran back to the barricade, pushing my way through the crowd, and climbed up onto the flatbed of Dave's truck, the single stained piece of paper clutched in my hand. The headlights of the truck illuminated me, turning the flatbed into a makeshift stage. "You're right, Dad," I yelled, my voice ringing out over the sudden silence. Every eye, my father's, the sheriff's, the town's, was on me. "It is business, and you're the one who always taught me to read the fine print." I held up the document. It was a flimsy, yellowed copy of a deed from 1923. "While you were buying up access roads," I shouted, "I was at the county archive. This is the original deed for Granger's Mill. And right here in Section 4 is an ironclad community access clause." I started to read, my voice shaking with adrenaline and pure, unadulterated triumph. "It guarantees perpetual right of access to all residents of Miller's Creek, to the property known as Granger's Mill, including the road thereto, for the purpose of commerce and sustenance, so long as the aforementioned mill shall be in operational use." I lowered the paper and stared down at my father. "You can't block the road, Dad. You don't just own a road. You bought a property with a community access easement you were too arrogant to even look for. This farm is operational. This is commerce. And this," I gestured to the crates of food, "is sustenance. Sheriff," I turned to Collier, "my father isn't the victim here. He's the one illegally blocking a public easement." My father's face went white. His lawyer was already frantically typing into his phone. The sheriff just stared at me, then at the deed, then back at my father. A slow grin spread across his face. "Mr. Lewis," Collier said, his voice now booming with authority, "it appears you are in violation of a county easement. I'm going to have to ask you to remove these barricades immediately." Just then, a white news van, one I hadn't even noticed, screeched to a halt, its floodlight blinding. A local reporter, an ambitious young woman I recognized from the Valley Ledger one Dave had tipped off, jumped out, a cameraman in tow. And right behind them in her polished Audi was Eliza. She must have been called in by my father for the victory, but she had arrived just in time for the execution. The reporter, sensing the bigger story, shoved her microphone right in Eliza's perfectly manicured face as she got out of her car. Ms. Lewis, your fiancé's platform is all about supporting rural America. What's your comment on your father, a wealthy developer, using a shell company to choke off a community farm's water supply, just to build a private golf course?" Eliza froze. She was caught in the glare of the camera, her practiced political smile collapsing. She looked at our father, whose face was now a terrifying shade of purple. She looked at the cameras, at the 100 angry farmers, at me standing above them all on the flatbed. This was the moment that would define her career. She stammered, no comment." It was devastating. The camera captured it all, her panic, her guilt, her utter damning silence. My father defeated by a 100-year-old piece of paper and his own daughter's cowardice. His face a mask of pure reptilian rage finally snapped. "Stand down," he hissed at his men. "Get those barriers out of here. Now!" A wild, deafening cheer erupted from the crowd. My father had lost. He had lost the farm, he had lost his leverage, and he had lost his legacy all in one night. I held his gaze for one long silent second from the top of the truck. He stared back at me with a hatred so profound it was almost impressive. Then I did what I had dreamed of doing for a year. I turned my back on him. I hopped down from the flatbed, picked up an empty crate, and rejoined the human chain. "Let's get this done," I said, my voice hoarse, and under the bright, unforgiving floodlights of the news camera, the harvest of Granger's Mill continued. The Harvest War, as the Valley Ledger promptly dubbed it, exploded. The local reporter's story was cinematic gold. The footage of my sister Eliza frozen in the headlights stammering "no comment" as the camera zoomed in on her face, juxtaposed with the shot of 100 farmers defiantly passing crates over my father's illegal barricade, was pure catnip for the regional news. The David versus Goliath local farm. Beat's predatory developer narrative was picked up by affiliates in Boston and beyond. We weren't just a farm anymore. We were a symbol of community resilience. The fallout for my father was immediate and catastrophic. His Summit Ridge luxury resort was dead on arrival. His high-profile partners terrified of the toxic PR connecting them to a man who would choke off a farm's water to build a private golf course, pulled out of the deal within a week. He was a pariah in Miller's Creek and a significant liability in Boston. As for Eliza, her engagement was indefinitely postponed, according to a curt announcement in the Boston social pages. The junior senator's family, it turned out, couldn't risk being associated with such a grubby public scandal. Her smart merger had dissolved. For us, the publicity was a tidal wave of goodwill. The Harvest Hub was saved. Our CSA membership list quadrupled in 48 hours. Donations poured in, not just cash, but people offering a used and working tractor lumber for the barn, even a local well-digging service free of charge. The media attention brought something even better. A state agricultural fund, impressed by our resilience and the legal ironcladness of that 1923 deed, reached out. They offered us what we'd only dreamed of, a low-interest long-term loan to buy the property outright. 2 weeks later, Dave and I sat at a lawyer's table, my hand aching as I signed the final page of the mortgage. The mill was ours. Ours. Not leased, not borrowed, but ours. I walked back onto the property, the air bustling with new volunteers and the sound of hammers repairing the barn roof. It was a complete victory, a total vindication. I looked at the thriving farm we had literally bled for, and I felt a profound sense of peace. I had won. But the win felt strangely quiet. I had won the war, but in the process I had completely and irrevocably lost the family I was born into. A month later, a registered letter arrived from a high-priced Boston law firm. It was stiff, formal, and cold. My parents were formally disinheriting me, citing gross insubordination and public defamation. It was the final severing. I looked at the letter with its embossed letterhead and crisp, cutting legal language. Then I looked at the field outside where Arthur was teaching a group of high school kids from the next town over how to plant strawberries. I walked to the old cast-iron wood stove in the mill's kitchen where we made coffee every morning. I folded the letter, struck a match, and watched the official notification of my orphanhood curl into black ash. I used it as kindling to light the morning fire. A year later, Granger's Mill was unrecognizable. It was no longer a struggling farm. It was the vibrant heart of the valley. The Harvest Hub was a massive success. The main barn, once red-tagged and condemned, now housed a bustling farm-to-table restaurant with a 3-week waitlist for reservations. The old stables were converted into a community kitchen where we taught canning, baking, and cooking classes 5 days a week. We weren't just supplying Miller's Creek. Our co-op supplied produce to 3 counties. I was no longer just Sharon the farmer. I was a respected community leader, a keynote speaker at sustainable farming conferences, and a board member for the new county agricultural fund. I was washing carrots for the dinner service, the sweet, earthy smell coating my hands, when the polished silver Audi pulled up the gravel road. It looked as out of place as my mother's Mercedes once had. The door opened and Eliza got out. She wasn't the polished political aide anymore. She was dressed down in expensive jeans and a simple cashmere sweater, but she looked tired, small, and hollowed out. The engagement I'd heard through the grapevine was officially off. The scandal had tainted her, made her politically toxic. She was a casualty of her own compliance, and I'd heard my father furious at her weak performance on camera had cut her off too. She stood awkwardly by the new welcome sign. "Sharon," she said, her voice thin, I just wanted to see what you've built. It's incredible." I just nodded, not stopping my work, the cold water running over my hands. "I wanted to apologize," she rushed on, twisting her hands. "I didn't know how deep it went, Sharon. I swear. He told me it was just a simple buyout, that you were being stubborn." I finally stopped and looked up at her, my hands dripping. "You didn't know, or you didn't want to know, Eliza." I said it quietly, without the rage I once felt. It was just a cold, hard fact. "You stood right there in his office. You looked me in the eye and called his offer generous. You held the eraser, Eliza. You were ready to wipe me away." Tears welled in her eyes. I had no choice." "We all have a choice," I said, turning back to the carrots. Desperation flashed across her face. "Please, Sharon. I'm lost. I have nowhere to go. Maybe I could help. I'm still a lawyer. I could do legal work for the co-op pro bono, for free, anything." I paused. I looked past her into the kitchen, where Dave, now my partner in business and in life, was laughing with Arthur over a hot stove. I saw the community members, my new family, setting tables for dinner. I looked back at my sister, a stranger in a designer sweater, begging for a legacy she hadn't earned. "No," I said. It wasn't angry, it wasn't vengeful, it was just final. "You chose your legacy, Eliza. This one's mine." She stared at me, the last bit of hope draining from her face. She got back in her silent, expensive car and drove away down the road my father had tried to steal. I watched her go, and for the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel a single solitary shred of envy. I just felt free. The first official Granger's Mill Harvest Festival was pure, beautiful chaos. The entire valley, it seemed, had shown up. Hundreds of people, maybe more, thronged the grounds, which were strung with fairy lights that glowed warmly in the cool autumn twilight. A local bluegrass band was set up on the porch of the old mill, their music fast and bright, weaving through the crowd. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke from 3 massive barbecue pits, and the sweet, sharp scent of our own apple cider being pressed fresh by the barn. Kids, their faces sticky with caramel, ran laughing through the fields we had fought for. Long tables built by Arthur and the volunteer team groaned under the weight of a potluck that stretched for 50 yards. It was a physical, breathing, laughing manifestation of community. Dave, his hand warm on my back, nudged me toward the small stage. "Go on," he smiled. "They're waiting." I stepped up to the microphone, my heart thumping a heavy, steady beat against my ribs. The music quieted, and all those faces turned to me. I saw them. In the front row, Arthur, decked out in a clean plaid shirt, was tapping his good foot to the last strains of the fiddle. I saw the faces of the first 100 families, the ones who had signed that first CSA list, who had bet on us when we were nothing but a desperate promise. I started, my voice catching thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "I don't have a speech. I just wanted to thank you." I looked out at the sea of people, my people. A year ago, my father called this place a graveyard. He told me legacy was about building resorts of glass and steel. He told me it was a name on a building. I shook my head, the feeling of catharsis washing over me clean and sharp. "You all taught me what legacy really means. It's not a name, it's not an inherited trust fund, it's this. I swept my arm out at the lights, the food, the families. It's the food on the table. It's the neighbor you can count on in the middle of the night. It's the community you build with your own two hands. It's leaving the ground and the people on it better than you found them. In that moment, the last vestiges of the old me crumbled away. I was no longer Sharon Lewis, the scrap daughter, the one begging for a loan at a mahogany table. I was just Sharon, the harvest woman. This right here, this loud, messy, vibrant crowd, this was my family. The thought of my old one, Mark, Catherine, Eliza, didn't even sting anymore. They weren't a source of anger, they were just irrelevant. They were a cold, distant, silent memory. This, my new life, was loud and real and wonderfully, truly mine. I look out at the crowd, at the kids with sticky faces from our apple cider, at the old-timers, and the new families all sharing a meal grown from the land we saved together. My father wanted to build a legacy of glass and steel, an empty monument to his own name. But this is ours. And the strange, wonderful thing is, it took losing a family to finally truly build a home. It's amazing what can grow from the ashes of betrayal. What did you think of Sharon's quiet revenge, where success made her family completely irrelevant? We want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Please subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.